my name is and I'm the Diabetes Educator here at the Lighthouse of Houston. We're here today to do a video on some tips, tricks, and tools to use in the kitchen and cooking when you're visually impaired or blind. And we have a special guest here with us today. Her name is Jennifer, and I'm going to let her introduce herself.
Hello, my name is Jennifer Parrish, and I've been an employee of the Lighthouse of Houston for approximately 20 years, and I'm also visually impaired, so I'll be observing as we move along here.
The first topic I want to cover is going over some organization tips that you can use in the kitchen before you start preparing your meal. One tip with keeping your pantry organized is to make sure that you keep your spices and ingredients in a consistent location so that you know that you're going to the same place to get that ingredient each time. Also, for the ingredients that you use the most often, it's helpful to keep them in the front or at an easy to reach location. One other tip that you want to do is use bump dots or rubber bands to label different spices and seasonings. This can help you keep track of what is what in the pantry. And it's also important to try to label these immediately once you get home from the store. The next thing I want to talk about for a few minutes is just expiration dates and what are some good ways to figure out if foods are still in date or if they're expired. And so I'm actually going to turn this over to Jennifer for a minute so she can talk about a couple things that are helpful for this.
Okay, so a couple of ways to tell whether your spices are expired or not. If you have some vision and you have access to a CCTV, then of course use that, and if you can see the date, that's perfect. If you have less vision, then you can use an app on your phone, download it, it's called Be My Eyes, and that will give you access to a sighted person who can read to you like the expiration date and whatnot, and be able to help you in that fashion. Also, follow your nose, guys, because it always knows. You know when something smells bad, and when it smells bad, it's not good for you. So let's use that tip first and foremost. And that's it.
Now I'm going to move on and start talking about some different cooking tips for when you're ready to actually start preparing your meal. So one thing you want to make sure when you first start is that you have adequate lighting above you to optimize the use of your vision. Another important thing whenever you're cooking is to try to utilize different bump dots for different kitchen equipment. For example, an oven or a stove, you can put the bump dots on if you have a knob to turn. One example, like on the stove here, is that there's a bump dot at the top where it would line up with when off is at the top. And there's also a bump dot on the 350-degree marker. And so that way you know if you're turning the knob, if the two bump dots are aligned, it's at 350 degrees. Also on the burners, there's a bump dot on the low, the medium, and the high settings. So that's very helpful so that you know, especially if this is an electric stove, so you know how hot you're turning it up to. And I'm going to let Jennifer talk a little bit more about the use of different types of bump dots.
Okay guys, let's talk about bump dots. So today's world has a lot of touch screen appliances and what have you, and I feel in my own personal experience that the use of bump dots is imperative. It's do or die for like I have them on my thermostat, I've got them on my oven, which I'll have like one on a bake button and one like on the temperature up, so I can like tell where, you know, to turn the temperature up, because obviously you have to, it's all touchscreen, you can't see it at all. So I can hit that and, you know, things like that. There are different sizes, so if you have a smaller area, you would obviously use a smaller dot, and then if you have a bigger space and more room, then you could, you know, obviously use a bigger dot. Also, if you are purchasing these bump dots, which are by the way available here at the Lighthouse of Houston in our Reflections store, they're very inexpensive, but you would want to buy multiple sheets of these things, because personal experience, they lose their adhesiveness quickly, especially when you're touching things multiple times and you're cooking and you've got maybe stuff in your hands or blah, blah, blah. So, imperative. So, yes, bump dots for sure.
Next, I'm going to talk about some tips for using measuring cups and measuring spoons. So these are just some ideas, but just keep in mind, do whatever is helpful for you. Whenever you're using measuring cups, it can be helpful to have different colored measuring cups. For example, you might want to have a set of white measuring cups and a set of black measuring cups. And this would just be, for example, if you're measuring out flour, you might want to measure those in black measuring cups so you can see the contrast of the color if you do have some vision. And then vice versa, for if you are measuring out darker ingredients, you might want to use lighter colored measuring cups so you can see the contrast in those. Also, if you do have some vision as well, making sure that the measuring cups have large print on them can make the numbers easier to read. Another idea is this set of measuring spoons. If you're able to see these, they're all different colors. They're bold colors. And what's helpful about that is if you're not able to read the numbers on them and tell, is this a fourth of a teaspoon, is this half a teaspoon, you can tell, okay, well, the littlest one, the fourth a teaspoon is green, and I know the half a teaspoon is red, and then you could also keep track of which measuring spoon is which measurement through the colors. A couple other ideas for when you're actually using these to measure ingredients out. So let's say you're trying to measure out some sugar for a recipe. It might be helpful for you when you're pouring it into the measuring cup to hold the measuring cup over a sink, just so that when you level off the measuring spoon, the extra ingredients fall into the sink. Now, if you don't want your ingredients going into the sink or it's not accessible when you're cooking, you could also use something like a paper plate or a large, spill pan, and then put the measuring cup over that, so when you level off the ingredients, it falls onto that, and it's easily disposable, less mess for you to clean up. Now a few tips on setting a timer to make sure you know when your food is done. The first thing I want to talk about is a large print timer. So if you do have some vision, you could use one of these. They have larger print, so the numbers are easier to read. Another thing that is an option is a talking timer, and we do not have one of those on hand right here, but we do sell those in the Lighthouse store if that is something that you're interested in. And then the last thing I wanted to suggest is that you can always use your phones. Most of us have either an iPhone or some sort of phone that we can say, hey Siri, can you set my alarm for 30 minutes or set a timer for 30 minutes? And then it'll do it, and then it'll announce to you when your food is ready. The next topic that I wanted to talk about was when you're actually preparing foods over the stove. So it is helpful to try to use saucepans more often than frying pans, just because saucepans generally have higher sides. And this is helpful because the food won't spill over as easily. Also, it's good to use a pan that's larger than the size of a pan you might normally use, just because if you're stirring ingredients around and if your vision is impaired and you can't see where the food is going quite as well, it's helpful so that you have extra room to stir around in. There's other things that you can do. For example, if you're cooking ground beef, one idea is if you need to chop up the meat, you can use tools like a potato masher. So part of this is just getting creative in the kitchen and doing things a little bit differently than you normally would.
All right, y'all, I'm going to talk for a second about just using our senses, and this is common sense. But as we all know, our eyes are a little not as great as everybody else's, so we've got to rely on other things to ensure that our food is done and edible. So, first of all, you're going to use your sense of smell. For instance, things like garlic, onions, vegetables, when they're starting to caramelize and cook, then they will smell like they're cooking, and they'll give off aromas as while they're cooking. Bacon's another one. You can obviously tell when that's cooking and almost done and almost burning, so you got to really pay attention to that. Meat as well. Okay, next we're gonna just listen, and this is an obvious one, but you want to listen for like sizzle changes and things. Whenever things are cooking, they're going to sound different whenever they're finished. They're not going to Like for instance, whenever you're cooking like ground beef and it's not raging grease and it's kind of calmed down, you can determine that it's kind of done because it's just sitting there chilling in the grease. Also, our hands. So when you're preparing food for other people, you're going to obviously want some rubber gloves because we have to touch things. We just have to sometimes. So invest in those. They sell them at Costco and we buy a ton of them. But you can check, like when you've cooked a steak, you can feel like if it's spongy. If you like it medium rare, you can feel it that way. Also just consistency of vegetables. Obviously you don't want to touch anything that's burning or on fire, but just it can help. We have to use what we're given. So yeah.
There are just a couple more tips I wanted to cover in the cooking section. So one other way to check for doneness for meat is you can use a talking thermometer. Meat is one of those things that you want to make sure is not undercooked, especially if it's like chicken or pork. And so you can use something like this that'll, it'll tell you when it's on, and then you can insert it into the meat and it'll read the temperature to you. Another thing to remember when you're cooking is you want to make sure that you're using good oven mitts when you're placing stuff in the oven and taking it out. Ideally, you would have oven mitts that would go all the way up to your elbow, just to make sure that your arm does not get burned when you are doing that, but definitely invest in some good oven mitts if you like to cook. Now I want to touch on some knife and cutting board skills to make sure that you're staying safe when preparing your food in the kitchen. The first thing you want to do is make sure that you have a good cutting board. So one thing that can be beneficial if you do have some vision is to get a cutting board that is white or light colored and one that is black or darker colored. Or if you could glue them both together like this one and flip them over depending on what side you need. And this is also similar to with the measuring cups where you just want to have contrasting colors so you can see what you're actually chopping. Ideally, you want to get a cutting board that has some rubber grips, at least on the corner or the bottom, so that it stays in place. You don't want your cutting board sliding around while you're chopping your food. But if it does not have that, one other thing you could do, depending on your cutting, on the countertops, is get a towel and actually place that under the cutting board if that helps keep it in place better. Also, touching on the knives a little bit. One thing that's very important to remember with knives is make sure that you have good sharp knives. And the reason for this is because if your knives are dull, you're going to have to put a lot more force on them when you're cutting, and then that just leaves more risk of hurting yourself, and we don't want you to do that. So make sure that the knives are sharp. Also, when you're not actively using a knife, I'd recommend make sure that you store it far back on the countertops away from where you're actually preparing the food, and that the blade is away from you so that it can't cut you, it's not going to fall off the countertop. Or you could place it in the sink. If you place it in the sink though, make sure that the blade is facing down so you don't cut yourself when you go to do the dishes. The last topic I wanted to go over was a few tips for when you are serving your meal that you've prepared. So one idea is utilizing a bar cart to actually transport your food from the kitchen to the table. This can be especially important if there's a long distance you have to travel between, or if you've prepared food for a large group, it's a heavy container of food, or it's really hot. It can be easier to actually place it on a cart and push that over instead of trying to carry that the whole way. A couple tips for when you're pouring beverages. One thing that you want to try to avoid is try to avoid using clear cups or glass cups on top of a white tablecloth. This is just because you can't see the contrast in the color as much. And then one other tip for pouring liquids is that you can actually utilize colored ping pong balls. You could put those in the bottom of a cup, and then once you're pouring liquid in, those ping pong balls will rise up so that you can tell around where the liquid is and when it's getting close to the top. But make sure that you don't put those in the dishwasher. I'm Lynn.
And I'm Jennifer.
Thank you for joining us for our cooking tools, tips, and tricks video. We really hope you enjoyed it.
And if you have any further inquiries about the items you saw today that we spoke of, you can call the Reflection Store at the Lighthouse of Houston. Phone number is 713-284-8466.